That's it.
There we are. Thank you.
Okay. There's a got it sign. Okay, so this is Food Talks. We're on our 29th Food Talk. It's been run, the first one is 2015. We've ran fish sustainability a couple of times before, and there were general discussions of fish sustainability. This time we're going with a more specific topic, center to discussions of sea sustainability is the MSC. So we're asking beyond the MSC, what next for sustainability? Food Talks is the 4 logos that you see there: Impact Hub London, Sustain, the Food Ethics Council, and Organico, which is myself and a brand called Fish Forever. So we're the 4 partners of Food Talks, and it's a kind of free organization where we will volunteer, which is why it's a little bit shoddy sometimes. Sorry to my partners. So really we don't do deep dives, but the whole idea is that we have a chance to ask a lot of questions and have a discussion. So each speaker will have 15 minutes. And today we have Amy Hammond from, she's head of oceans at the Blue Economy Practice at Seahorse Environmental. And she's a coordinator of the On the Hook campaign, which is both critiqued and urged reform of the MSC. They came out with a report, I think just yesterday. We have Momo Koshan, I hope that's said right, the surname. She works with the Sustainable Fisheries Trust on a community catch. And that's a new initiative looking to propose an alternative certification and also a free benchmarking tool for small-scale fisheries. At this point, I'm going to declare my own kind of personal interest. I know both Amy from On the Hooks. I'm a regular supporter of that campaign. And I'm very happily engaged in the Community Catch initiative with Momo, and that's where I met her. Actually, I didn't know her before, but I met her through the Community Catch. In Food Talks, we're increasingly aware of who gets to speak, who is listened to, and how a narrative is constructed, who gets to make the definitions, and we're conscious of trying to give voice to the unheard. And actually, fish sustainability is a topic where there's been a dominant discourse, and it's prevailed for quite a long time, and it's crowded out other approaches. We're at a point where 20% of wild fish is MSC certified, 50% of tuna is certified MSC. Pretty much all the UK supermarkets, all big business are signed up, and there is a whole ecosystem of organizations and pledges that basically stop anything else from being considered, even if and when it is better. In tuna, which is the second most consumed fish, and there's quite a lot of controversy around the MSC. And that's one of the main reasons we left the MSC. We were the first canned fish brand to be certified, and we left. And since then, we've joined a number of organizations and campaigns and pushed for alternative approaches. So it's kind of card on the table's confession that we're not the greatest fans of the MSC, but there is nuance in all of that. And we understand that it's a complex environment, that fisheries, a lot of fisheries need help, and they've gone a long way in that direction. And ironically, it's campaigns like On the Hook that make the MSC better. One of the issues that we're considering in this talk is the lack of representation for small-scale fisheries. So Bloom is a French NGO. It did quite a critical document or appraisal of the MSC some 3 or 4 years ago. They also in some of these pressure campaigns or groups to reform the MSC. And they analyzed that over a 9-year period, some 83% of certified MSC fish comes from industrial and what they describe as high impact fisheries. The small-scale, low-impact fisheries accounted for only 7%. In wild catch terms, for human consumption, it's 50-50 globally. So that's a kind of underrepresentation of small-scale fishing. What's kind of ironic about all this is that 47% of the images used by the MSC were of small-scale fishing. So it kind of shows that we know in our hearts what small-scale fishing would seem to look like. And these are the questions that hopefully we'll be able to discuss today. So let's go ahead, please, with Amy. Can we have Amy's slides up here, or are we looking for them?
Sorry, I'm just working out how to share my screen.
Oh, I thought Virginia might have had them. There we are.
Is that working?
Perfect. That is.
Great. Thanks so much, Charles, and thanks so much to all the event partners for inviting me today. As Charles said, I'm Amy Hammond. I run the Ocean and Blue Economy practice at Seahorse Environmental. So we're a public affairs consultancy, and we work with a number of activists, NGOs and businesses to run environmental advocacy and comms campaigns. For the past 5 years, I've coordinated the On the Hook campaign, which is a coalition of individuals and groups calling for reform of the Marine Stewardship Council, and that's going to be the theme of my presentation today. So just kind of taking us back to the basics for a minute, what actually is a sustainable fishery? In fact, this is not a very simple question to answer. There are lots of different understandings of this term, and those different understandings lie behind a lot of the conflict on this topic. So a conventional fisheries science answer would be that a sustainable fishery is one which is fished at maximum sustainable yield, so the maximum rate which can be replenished through reproduction. That concept has evolved over time to increasingly build in some degree of consideration of the impacts on the wider marine environment beyond the target stock, and this would be known as an ecosystem-based approach. But nonetheless, the premise of most conventional fisheries management still remains very much, how can we maximize economic exploitation of this fishery over the long term? The position that I would take, and the position that the On the Hook campaign is coming from, is that in the face of a global ocean crisis, we need to be moving much faster towards a really holistic concept of sustainable fishing, which genuinely considers the needs of the fish stock or the fish population, the health and functioning of the wider marine environment, the rights of the people working within the fishery, the rights of the wider communities who depend on that marine ecosystem for their livelihoods or for food security, and then kind of reaching up to the global scale, what the possible climate implications are of that fishing activity, which is something which we're really just starting to understand in any level of detail. In terms of who is responsible for the sustainability of fisheries, firstly, there's overwhelming evidence the world over that the best custodians of any natural resource are local communities. For the majority of human history, fish stocks were locally managed to meet local needs, and they seemed so abundant that the need for any other form of governance was hardly kind of conceptualized. It was only really during the 20th century that fishing was industrialized, catches increased, and vessels began to travel much further out to sea, which led to the introduction of much more top-down governance structures such as international agreements. There is still a very clear role for government, both in setting regulatory parameters for domestic fishing as demand increases, but particularly in mediating international competition. However, the decline of global fish stocks to a low point of several notable stock collapses in the 90s suggested that governments alone weren't able to tackle the issue of global overfishing. And this is the gap which the Marine Stewardship Council stepped into.
Marine Stewardship Council.
The Marine Stewardship Council started life as a joint venture by the conservation charity WWF and one of the world's largest food companies, Unilever. The driving force for its creation was that recognition of the failure of governments to tackle the overfishing crisis and a desire to instead harness the forces of the market to do so. The basic premise or the theory of change that the MSC works with is that MSC sets a standard for what is deemed to be sustainable. It created an eco-label, the blue tick logo, which you can see on screen, to denote the sustainability of a seafood product at the point of sale. And a fishery can then put itself forward for assessment against that MSC standard. It's not the MSC which assesses the fishery directly, instead it's an assessment body which is paid directly by the fishery. If the fishery then meets the MSC standard, its products can be sold carrying the blue tick eco-label. The premise of the scheme is then that that certification brings to the fishery either a price premium or some kind of market access for its products. And this then incentivizes additional fisheries to improve their standards seek to access the scheme and access those benefits in return. At first, the MSC model seemed to be working quite well in its early years, certifying some clearly sustainable fisheries and also driving a lot of improvements in terms of data collection, for example, which has historically been very poor in a lot of fisheries. Things got more complicated once the obviously sustainable fisheries had been certified, but interest and demand from some of the world's biggest retailers, such as Walmart, and some of its biggest restaurant groups, such as McDonald's, was growing. So essentially the demand for labeled sustainable seafood was growing much faster than genuinely sustainable supply could meet. From this point onwards, the argument that critics would make is that the MSC began to drop its bar for sustainability in order to grow and keep up with that demand, and that as a result, it was ending up greenwashing fisheries. So concerns started to arise and started to be flagged by campaigners and by NGOs that at the individual fishery level, MSC was certifying unsustainable fisheries, some which were killing endangered species, some where shark finning was happening, for example. And then, as Charles touched upon in his introduction, critics became concerned that overall, the MSC programme was so heavily geared towards large industrial fisheries in the global north that as it increasingly became a sourcing prerequisite for major retailers, it was actually serving as a market barrier to a lot of small-scale fisheries and those in the developing world. So in other words, MSC was entrenching the existing inequalities that we already have within the global fishing industry. So MSC certification increasingly became seen as synonymous with sustainability, and anything that didn't carry the label was seen as unsustainable, when in fact many ecologically and socially sustainable fisheries around the world simply couldn't afford to pay for certification or to collect the data that was needed. Finally, there were also some concerns around the setup of the MSC business model. So in particular, this sort of inherent financial conflict of interest created by fisheries directly paying the certifying bodies. So just quickly kind of to touch upon why all of this matters, a common criticism made of the On the Hook campaign is that despite the flaws of the MSC programme and the issues in some MSC certified fisheries, we're actually industry, and should we all instead be focusing our efforts on bringing the kind of worst offenders up to that level? It is definitely true that there are many worse fisheries out there, and there are many very good fisheries in the MSC program. So obviously there are fisheries within and outside MSC that require our attention. But what the MSC does really does matter. The organisation now directly certifies more than 15% of global wild marine catch. So the standards that it sets have wider implications by volume than the majority of government's policies. MSC also has a reach far beyond the fisheries which are currently certified, because it's so important now for market access and because it's included in various UN metrics and other kind of government measures. Many more fisheries around the world are currently aiming to reach that certification level. This means that the standard set by the MSC essentially serves as a definition of sustainability for a large portion of the global industry, and therefore it has the potential either to be a really key driver for ambition or to set a cap on ambition, depending on how ambitious the standard itself is. Finally, and probably most crucially, it's a consumer-facing label. So if a seafood consumer chooses an MSC product and often pays extra for it because they wish to make a more sustainable choice, they need to be able to trust in the claims that they're paying for. If some of those claims don't stand up to scrutiny, it risks undermining faith in the concept of sustainable fish. Within that context, we formed the On the Hook campaign almost 6 years ago. So this campaign brought together a group of individuals and organizations who were concerned about the MSC to campaign initially specifically against the recertification of the unsustainable PNA fishery, which is the world's largest tuna fishery. After several years of campaigning, we had secured some important policy changes from MSC relating to tuna fisheries, but our members were beginning to feel that these were still very limited against the wider backdrop of the MSC machine, and they really began to question whether it was worth putting so much capacity into driving improvements at the individual fishery level when actually the entire system needed reform. As a result, as a campaign, we moved away from focusing solely on tuna fisheries, and we launched a call instead for a root and branch review of the MSC. When MSC repeatedly failed to initiate this themselves, we decided to run our own external review, which we've just done over the past year, running a public online consultation, a series of expert roundtables, and just last week we published a report summarising all of that input and making a series of recommendations to MSC, which you can see on screen now. So these recommendations included tightening up the MSC standard itself, so that fisheries with high levels of bycatch or habitat damage or that threaten endangered species can't be certified. But they also include changing the overall philosophy of MSC. We don't believe that in the 21st century it's appropriate anymore to define sustainability as just an environmental question or just one which relates to the fish stock itself. And instead, we're calling on MSC to build much more incorporation of human rights, socioeconomic, climate impact of fisheries into its standard and into its certifications. Finally, we also included some recommendations about changing the MSC's business model to fix things like avoiding fisheries directly paying the certifying bodies and just removing any kind of conflicts of interest like that. So just to kind of wrap up, a little bit of a whistle stop through this topic and this campaign. What happens next for seafood sustainability certification? I would argue that that very much remains to be seen. It feels like we're at a genuine crossroads on this question. And I hope that we can maybe exchange some ideas on this during the discussion later. I think is, do we still face? I think each of us would probably answer that question differently depending on our personal politics, but looking at kind of the state of the world around us, it's probably difficult to have the same enthusiasm for the power of the market to fix the overfishing crisis as the MSC's founders had back in the 90s. If we accept that within the world and the system as it exists, there might be a role for the market in ensuring fisheries sustainability, then what does that look like? MSC is very well established. It has more or less a monopoly in the certified seafood space. Rather than seeking to replicate this infrastructure, given the urgency of the crisis, are we better working to reform MSC rather than replace it? That has always been the position of the On the Hook campaign so far. But as I hope I've given you a small flavour of, the reform that's needed is quite substantial. And finally, a key question, which I think Momo will probably touch on in much more detail, is whether the MSC can ever be appropriate for small-scale fisheries. Could it make changes to become meaningfully inclusive of the full diversity of global fisheries, or is something separate and more tailored needed for small-scale fisheries? So I'll leave it there for now, but very happy to answer any questions after the presentations are over or on email. I'll just whiz back to my email address on the first slide. And yeah, very much looking forward to hearing any thoughts on these ideas during the discussion.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Amy. Very speedy. Can we have Momo's presentation up? I'm not sure if that's her sharing the screen or if we're organising it for that.
I would appreciate if you could share it for me, Virginia. Would that be okay? Thank you. Well, I'll just start. Yeah, so first of all, thanks for the invitation and thanks for a great presentation, Amy. As was noted, I have been working in small-scale fisheries for quite a while, about 15 years working directly in small-scale fishing communities. So kind of to follow on what Amy has introduced, I want to talk about the perspective of small-scale fisheries globally, and talk a little bit about how the system hasn't really serviced their needs appropriately. So build the picture of how small-scale fisheries are on the ground and why they keep slipping through the net, basically, and see if there's what can be done to improve this. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of context. Small-scale fisheries do need context because I think it's quite normal that people don't realize just how large this sector is, how much a large proportion of the population small-scale fisheries actually are. So if we dig deeper, small-scale fisheries incorporates artisanal fisheries, small-scale fisheries that fish for local, domestic, regional, and international trade, but then also obviously the small-scale fisheries or subsistence fisheries that fish for food. There are a bunch of international conventions that relate specifically to small-scale fisheries. The UN Sustainable Development Goals have 14, SDG 14 relates to life underwater, and 14B very specifically focuses on small-scale fisheries. It calls for provision of access to small-scale artisanal fishers to marine resources and markets. So really calling for the need of small-scale fishers to get their product to market. Last year, 2022, was the International Year of Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture. That was really a full year focused on highlighting the work, the successes, the challenges of small-scale fisheries globally. And I think a really important output that came from that year was actually one which came from the small-scale fishers themselves. So it was kind of a call to action and rules of engagement, which the small-scale fisher organizations across 5 continents put out, basically promoting how small-scale fisheries need to be protected, how the resource needs to be restored, and how small-scale fishers need to continue contributing to the economies, the health, the culture, and the well-being. And then importantly also to mention are the small-scale fishery guidelines. So these came from the FAO. They're basically the result of many years of work, over 4,000 voices from fishers, small-scale workers in over 120 countries. And basically it describes how small-scale fisheries should be contributing to sustainable value chains for people and the planet. Next slide. And then I guess then as well, just to kind of, the context of the numbers. So this comes from the Illuminating Hidden Harvests report, which was also just released this year, and it really focuses on small-scale fisheries and kind of a lot of the unknowns that come from small-scale fisheries, because data just isn't very available or visible from small-scale fisheries. So if we think about global fish catches, about 92 million tons a year, and 40% of that comes from small-scale fisheries. Then 492 million people involved in kind of small-scale fishery activities. 60 million is directly in small-scale fishing, part-time and full-time work, 53 million in subsistence fishing, and then quite a large number that's related to families linked to people who are directly involved. Huge revenues, 77 billion a year. And then just, I guess, really importantly, the gender aspect is really important. Just small-scale fisheries do have an awful lot of goals that relate to sustainable fishing, that relate to healthy livelihoods, human rights, all those kind of things. So small-scale fisheries, they really are important. And I think a really important number to pull out of here is if we have 40% of the catch, and then we actually have 90% of the employment in fisheries. So if you put that into context, 90% of the employment of the people that create our seafood globally, and that comes from 40% of the catch. So we need more small-scale fishers to produce more seafood, basically. Next screen, please. You'll probably have to click through here to go through the, just keep clicking through. Just back. So those last slides were really like zooming out, thinking about small-scale fisheries, the numbers globally, and then I thought it appropriate to kind of zoom in and just get a couple of quotes from small-scale fishers and folks who work with small-scale fishers. So one comes from a small-scale fisher in Indonesia. So small-scale fishers are forced to live with giants. The giants are fishing vessels using destructive fishing gear, such as bottom trawlers. They take up a lot of space, they are greedy and reckless, and they destroy everything in the ocean. These destructive giants are colonial products that were introduced to Indonesia on the assumption that small-scale fishers are unable to produce and process fish efficiently. Small-scale fishers are powerless to confront them nor chase them away. We are forced to live with them. Another from, this is an organization that works with small-scale fishers, so from Costa Rica. Small-scale fisheries are threatened strongly by the blue economy movement that concentrates interest on the economics of marine resources. Small-scale fisheries are a way of life, and they need an integral perspective that needs to go beyond economics to be able to survive. The world will remember this when people will reach a market and fish will not be there. So I think it's just a way for us to understand just how the current system of growth, extraction, industrialization has and is impacting the very existence of small-scale fishers globally. Next slide. I'm just going to touch a little bit kind of on my experience of working in small scale fisheries and what that looks like on the ground. My experience has been predominantly in the global south, so working with development oriented NGOs, so working with the small scale fishing communities, working with industry, the supply chains linked to those fisheries, and then working in coordination with government. And I will say that there is, there's no one size fits all solution. There's no one size fits all approach that works in small scale fisheries. And that really is related to, the immense diversity that exists out there. There's lacking infrastructure. Small scale fisheries are pretty invisible at the policy level, at national and regional discussions, at decision making, right? So small scale fisheries just aren't at the table. I think it's also, it's interesting when you understand just how out of the system they often are. So an example from Indonesia is I had a lot of fishers that I worked with that, were deemed illegal. And the reason they were deemed illegal was because they needed to have their vessels registered in order to participate in, the certification program or the traceability program that was, being demanded by the Western market. And so, the fishers would go to their local government office to register, and the infrastructure, the process for registering a vessel just didn't exist, which meant the fishers were in this, in this limbo. We can't register, but then we can also can't send our product because we're not necessarily legal. So just really stuck in that kind of a limbo space. Next slide. I think that, the types of projects that I've worked on, they really fall into a wide spectrum, but they all kind of fall into what we kind of term in this landscape as improvement projects. So, working towards maybe meeting a quality standard or an environmental standard, or towards certification, meeting market demands, basically. So kind of activities that we would have conducted, collecting data, so that might be paper-based or technology-based, and always kind of bringing in, literacy capabilities of small-scale fishers on the ground. We worked a lot on forming associations, building cooperatives, and basically building the ability for fishers to collectively negotiate prices for their product, collectively push the government to move things to support and protect them. And I think then, very importantly, in a lot of my work, we have been focused on accessing markets. So that might be directly engaged in a certification scheme, building the business capabilities of fisher groups, and basically, developing business plans, improving their commercialization prospects. So one thing that always struck me, and I think it's how the market kind of system works, in that very often if we'll say, a lot of the pressure, a lot of the technical and financial pressure is put on the small scale fishers. So again, take an example, you have a retailer in the Northern Hemisphere, and they're making a sustainability commitment to source only certified and fully traceable product by the year 2025. I am generalizing when I say this. There's a lot of great retailers out there, so I am generalizing, but so that retailer then basically is sourcing from a small scale fishery in the global south. And those commitments are pushed to that small scale fishery, right? We need traceability, we need data collection, we need A, B, and C in order to meet the current demand in the market. So the cost of implementing, the traceability system gets pushed onto the small scale fishing community in, again, example, Indonesia. So the retailer can tell a really nice story where, we have all these great things happening, all our ducks are in a line. And really all of the pressure is on the small scale community to make kind of these commitments come true. So they might have to invest in new processes, new technology, new buildings, and to meet kind of the ever increasing requirements of the market, right? It used to be environmental, then traceability came along, now human rights. So this is all things that have to happen at the community level, and where very often the costs are also pushed onto the community. And otherwise they run the risk of basically losing market access. So to kind of reflect, next slide, please, to reflect on the work of what I have been doing in the community. I do think it's important, like the pieces that I really felt were working and that were really showing progress. So data collection being one of them. So data collection is pretty onerous. Data collection for fisheries management is onerous. It's not necessarily satisfying for the fishers involved, but it is important to get, you know, these invisible fisheries into a better managed state. So we realized, you know, collecting data for fisheries management, if we added data points that would actually feed back to the fishers. So we started collecting information on income, expenditure, size, quality, and fed this back to the fishers. So they were able to understand their operations better, create a better, higher quality product, and hopefully get a better price in the market. So yeah, other successful pieces were linking, this is something that Amy said, right? So just doing environmental improvement at the community level wasn't really working. So by packaging it with social improvements, bringing the two together really seemed to work. So imagine bringing a health program to a community, offering health services to a fishery and to their families. And then asking them to engage in data collection, much more efficient than just asking them to involve in data collection. And then the other thing that I will note is like long-term engagement with small-scale fisheries is important. It's resource demanding, it's expensive, but it is beneficial. Another story I like to tell from Indonesia is basically a fisher we begged to come to a co-management meeting to meet government officials and industry. He sat at the back of the room, smoked a cigarette and got his free lunch and headed out the door. And the same fisherman is now, you know, jetting to Jakarta, talking to government officials. His fishery is fair trade and MSC certified. And, you know, you can just see like the empowerment of working with these fisheries over longer time. Next slide, please. So kind of back to the MSC and how I've seen kind of the small scale fisheries engage with the MSC process. I will put my hand up. The MSC I've often encountered them on the ground trying to, you know, support programs to get fisheries engaged in their program. But from what I've seen, very often the barriers are just too big, right? The standard is really technically difficult to engage with. The gaps that the small scale fisheries have to meet the bar of the standard are so complex and so expensive to do the improvements to get there. And then just the certification process, as noted before, is just really really costly and financially prohibitive nearly 100% of the time. So the only fisheries that I know that are certified have had really, really big philanthropic and NGO and industry support to get things moving and to get them maintained, which is not necessarily a scalable model, you know, in its current format. Next slide. So do I have the answer? Is Communicatch the answer? I'm not necessarily sure it's the full answer, but we are definitely hoping that we're building something that has some hope for small scale fishers. Next slide. Next slide. What are we? We are a market-based development initiative. Yeah, this slide is fine. Basically, we're a market-based development initiative. We are a certification, we have a certification piece in our program. So this is the idea that we have set a bar that we would like fisheries to meet. But this bar is not just environmental, it's across environmental, social and economic pieces. And we have with a standard that sets out that bar. We have an improvement pathway. So basically an improvement phase that will support fishers and fisheries to move along the pathway to get to that bar over time. There will be chain of custody and there will be an integrated digital platform kind of in the background of that. We're very aware that, you know, there's been 20 to 25 years of certification programs out there, not just in fisheries, but across other sectors, commodities. And we can learn a lot, we have learned a lot. And so a lot of the things we're putting into Communicatch are very intentional, right? They're based on gaps that exist in existing schemes, what we've learned out there. Now, we are also very aware that you can't just write a standard, relatively complex, fisheries is complex, and put it out there in the world for small scale fishers and presume that they will come. So we're very much aware, because our target are small scale fisheries, that we have to build a huge support network around this. We have to build infrastructure and we have to basically build the ability for the hand-holding of some of these fisheries to do the improvements to meet this standard. So we really are thinking a lot about the infrastructure, the tools, the capacity building opportunities that are going to be needed and the support services for the small scale fisheries to engage in the whole process. Our guiding principles are there, the key attributes: accessibility, affordability, and credibility. So accessibility, we're thinking about that in terms of language, right? Not just translating it into all the languages that will be needed, but also like breaking down the technical languages, the jargon, making it more accessible in that way, having the digital platform also enhancing the accessibility. Affordability is a really key piece, which was noted about the MSC, and we are working really hard to make sure that that is not the case here. How are we doing that? We're streamlining kind of various pieces, the auditing processes, having desk-based audits versus on-site audits. And we're also making sure that our business model will equitably distribute the costs, right? So rather than the fishery having to pay, so the small scale fishing community having to pay for the certification, but actually that the supply chain, that the various nodes of the supply chain each contribute, and that the money is filtered back to the communities to support the improvement and to support the payment of the certification. And then credibility. The market does, is making commitments, and we're aware that we need to meet the needs of the market. So in building kind of the draft standard that we currently have, we have used international best practice. We are using, international conventions, and we are following kind of the well-known benchmarks that are out there. So yeah, in summary, I know I'm at time. So last slide. In summary, what we're building at Community Catch is really for small scale fishers. It's the small scale fishers are at the core of why we're building this, how we're building it. Small scale fisheries is not an add-on. We have it's unique that we have been able to build this with small scale fishers at the center of this. So if we think of other certifications, they built their standards or their programs based on fisheries in general. We've been able to build in the intricacies and the uniqueness of small scale fisheries from the very beginning. So as noted already, we're across a wider spectrum. It's not just environmental. We do have climate change in there. We have animal welfare, obviously the social pieces, human rights, all of that is in there, which I think much better reflects kind of the situation of small scale fishers on the ground. And then again, as I said already, we really want our business model to support the small scale fishers in this. This will be a not-for-profit where basically the business model will ideally be filtering quite a lot of the funds back to support the small scale fisheries, to do the improvement, to engage in the certification, and to make sure that they're accessing the markets that they need to. So is it the answer? I'm not sure, time will tell, but we're definitely hoping that we'll be able to contribute to supporting small scale fisheries and meeting their market needs in the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you very, very much for that. We're going to open it up to the audience here. So I think, I don't know if we've got a master mute, but maybe we should take that off, and let's work on two ways. One with the hand up, so I can call someone who wants to ask a question, and then Lee's following the chat, and he can ask questions from the chat. So hands up on the Zoom buttons and the chat. I don't know, I've got a kind of odd question to start for Momo. That first slide where you've got people almost doing acrobatics on the water, what on earth is that fishing?
It's a really good point. I actually don't know. God, that's terrible. I actually don't know. It was the slide deck that was in my folder. Oh,
I'm sorry.
No,
we're gonna have to find out.
I will find out, Charles.
It might be deeply unsustainable. And for Amy, my question is, the MSC says it's just performed its biggest review and reform of its standards. It's engaged with a lot of stakeholders, including On the Hook. And it says that these are the best reforms, or the broadest reforms addressing most issues. So do you think the new standards kind of gets the MSC off the hook?
Yeah, I mean, I guess firstly, to give kind of credit where credit's due, MSC have just done an enormous multi-year review and many stakeholder consultation processes. They have fixed some really big loopholes. from the previous version of the standard, most notably in terms of what we've been campaigning on. They've really tightened up their requirements on shark finning to make sure that there is now hopefully fairly minimal chance of that happening within certified fisheries. In other areas, they didn't make the changes we wanted to see. The standard still doesn't really touch on human rights. It doesn't touch on the issue of harmful subsidies in the fishing industry. The final new version of the standard, which they just published, actually takes several steps back from some of the draft versions that were consulted on around issues such as harassment of marine mammals. So I think in short, my answer, Charles, would be it's a bit of a mixed bag. They've made kind of some steps forward. We would argue not enough. And the whole review process was very focused just on the standard and not on what we would call the kind of wider philosophy and the business model. So what does MSC consider sustainability to mean, and how is its business model set up to reward genuine sustainability?
Right, great, thanks. Lee, does anybody have questions on the hand up, or Lee, do you want to start going through some of the chat questions?
We've got a couple of good questions here. We've had 3 so far, so keep popping them in the chat and I'll feed them in. So the first question, which comes from Dan of Food Ethics Council, is what would help models like community catch to grow and spread and potentially be replicated?
Yeah, good question. So I think what's important here is actually the market, right? So I mean, a model like community catch is only going to work if the market accepts that, you know, community catch is robust and that our standard, you know, is sustainable, and so that they will then source the product. So I think that's really important. So a lot of it lies with the market kind of getting behind this. And I will say as well, you know, something that Amy mentioned, right? At the moment, it's a lot of industrial fisheries that are certified and small scale fisheries are not. So there is also a little bit of a mismatch, right? If you have small scale fisheries that are to become certified, very often retailers, food service, they're looking for large volumes, which don't necessarily come from small scale fisheries. So if we want models like this to be replicated, then also the buyers, the market need to kind of also be okay with maybe changing their sourcing, you know, volumes, open themselves up to putting more products on the shelf across a wider range, not just go with the, you know, 5 typical species or whatever. So I think a lot of it depends on, you know, the market, and then obviously on the consumer, you know, accepting what the market puts in front of them. So yeah, I put a bit of pressure on the consumers and the market to help these kind of models replicate.
Excellent. Okay, so we've got another question. We've got a question from Andrea, who, well, it's a 2-part question really, so either of you are welcome to jump in on this. But first part is how many small fisheries are we talking about that are based in the UK, and could there be more of a local public awareness campaign, say you know, local fish for local people, or would that not be sustainable? And then the second part of this is, would an overall shift to more plant-based diets solve some of the issues and remove the challenge of volume?
Want to go, Amy? Shall I go? I'm happy to jump in.
First, yeah.
Yeah, so small scale fisheries in the UK. So we did do kind of a quick number crunch on this when we were starting with community catch. So I'm not sure about the volumes, but I know that the number of vessels, if you talk about number of vessels in the UK, I think 90 or 92% of vessels in the UK are actually small scale. So again, it's kind of like the numbers that I showed, right? It might not be equate to volumes, because the volumes from the large industrial vessels are obviously huge, but the number of vessels and the number of people employed in small scale is quite large in the UK. So about kind of, yeah, keeping fish for local people, I would very much be, I hope that community catch will be able to support that type of a model. So to really support domestic, we'll say keeping fish domestic and having it certified, right? So I know in speaking with UK retailers, a lot of them have said, we just can't put small scale product that we'd like to put on our shelves because we have a sustainability commitment that says we will only have fish that's certified or whatever, and none of these small scale fisheries are certified. So I think there's a real willingness to actually, yes, do that, keep the products local, not have as many air miles. You know, we're talking about all of these things constantly. So I think that it is smart. And I will also then will say in the developing world, we'll say in Peru, right, there's a really big shift of people from fishing or from shopping in markets to shopping in supermarkets. So how can we keep, you know, Peruvian product rather than exporting it? How can we keep it in Peru for Peruvians, right? So could Community Catch also support kind of a model there that that puts sustainable product from domestic fisheries in domestic retailers? So we're definitely hoping to be involved in that. And then kind of on the plant-based diets, absolutely. I myself do eat a little bit of fish, but only a little bit. So yes, I mean, I think we have to be smart here, right? I don't advocate for people to stop eating fish at all. I think we just have to be aware of what we're eating, where it's from, whether it comes from a sustainable-ish fishery or whether, you know, whether it comes from a local fishery. I would always advocate to maybe know where your fish comes from at least, and know that you feel comfortable that it hasn't come from really far, or that you don't know anything about, you know, the human rights that might exist. So that would be kind of my point there. Over to you, Amy.
I mean, I would absolutely agree with everything that you've just said. I guess the only thing that I would add on the UK small scale fishery side is just there's a question of kind of consumer tastes and consumer preferences. So here in the UK, we're actually very unadventurous in terms of the fish that we eat. And people like a lot of imported tuna and salmon, which largely comes from farms. So I think that could be a really great campaign to kind of increase public awareness of all of the fisheries that we do have around the UK, including small scale fisheries, and get people kind of appreciating a bit more of a range of seafood options.
Yeah, I wanted to add, there's two organizations that you might want to check out there, Andrea. There's Low Impact Fisheries of Europe, which is spelled LIFFE, and look at them on the website, and they're kind of representing the low impact fisheries probably on the EU scale. And there's an organization called NUFTA, which is now I'm not sure if they've changed their name. So if you can't find them, send me a message and I'll find them. But that was the kind of under 10s organization, and they try and represent the British fish. So if you're kind of looking for some more information in that area. I've got two hands up. I've got Serge. I'm not going to try your surname.
No worries, Charles. Hey,
So
everyone. Yeah, hi from Cape Town, South Africa. Thank you so much for organizing this webinar. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. Really interesting to listen to you, Amy and Momo. I have a question. I'm trying to think out of the box. I'm trying to kind of reflect on my work in small scale fisheries as well, and what sort of I've seen. And my question to all of you is, don't you feel the market in the global north has sort of jumped on the bandwagon of certification as a sort of a one-stop shop solution or pathway towards solution, but that actually, you know, we should be spending much more of our time and effort on traceability and transparency in the supply chain. And I know the one can be connected to the other, but it doesn't always is. I know many MSC certified fisheries are not fully traceable, and the other way around. So my point or my question is, don't you think we should be spending way more time on supporting fisheries to achieve transparency and traceability in the supply chain? And certification is a nice add-on. And we should, yeah, that's my question. What do you think?
That's a big question. Is that for you, Momo, or Amy? Which one of you wants to take that?
Want to go, Amy?
Yeah, I mean, I think Momo, you're probably better placed to speak to that in the kind of on the feasibility side, I guess, from a sort of campaigning side. I would say absolutely. As Momo said earlier, there's a really big range of retailers, and some of them are absolutely fantastic and doing loads of extra due diligence. But in general, yes, I do worry that there's much too much reliance on certification as a kind of outsourcing of that responsibility. And certification is one important kind of tool that we can use, but it can't guarantee the whole holistic sustainability of global fisheries. So yes, I would completely agree with you, but I will definitely hand over to Momo for more of the on the ground feasibility of that.
I mean, I could butt in and I could say the problem maybe with transparency, traceability often by itself is we've seen it going straight to a big industrial boat that say a general maker brand like Chickens of the Sea, just to name one, puts on there, and it's meaningless. And it seems to imply that you've got, you do know where your fish is coming from, but you don't know why it's good to buy. And this is the tricky part. So that's what I would interject that. But Momo, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I totally agree. I mean, to my point earlier, right? Like, know where your product has come from, and that will probably tell you a little bit, at least, about the other pieces. So I would definitely be about transparency. I think, to Charles's point, there's so many types of traceability out there, right? Some of them are like, you know, a QR code, which, you know, tells a nice story about, you know, a community, but it might not say anything about that community on a given day. It might just be, you know, something that was written up about that community. You get that QR code. But I think there's it's getting more and more sophisticated. Traceability, you know, can go back to a vessel. It can go back to a community. It can tell you a lot about where your product is coming from. So I absolutely agree that it's really important. And yeah, I mean, the thing with certification, especially as it is at the moment, right? You have a label on your product, and as a consumer, I think, you know, you see that label and you trust that that means lots of great stuff about your product, but you don't actually, because, you know, a label is small, you don't actually know what that means, right? So it might not mean quite as much as what you presume it means, right? So maybe with transparency and being actually allowing fisheries and communities to really promote all of the various things that they're doing, that's kind of what I see the benefit of transparency and traceability, indeed, to like being able to tell that story, which might not always fit directly into, you know, the square box of a specific certification.
Great. Is that good, Serge? We've got Maskur Tamayira. Can we have your question, please?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Hi, Momo.
Hi,
And for the question that being asked in the previously by Charles, it's highly likely a Vietnamese traditional fishing practice that show the acrobat thing. And hello, I'm from Indonesia. I'm based in Makassar. It's 2:30-ish in the morning now. So maybe I will speak a little bit slow because I'm mostly my printing in my my mother language. So basically, I also try to enhance what Momo already been said, that basically the certification is helping us in the local stakeholder to understanding what's the demand from the outside. But in the end, it's occupied the government perspective or the industrial perspective that we need only to meet the standard that created by the certification. It is great to having this kind and participating in this kind of the discussion or talk from my perspective, because I'm basically dealing in day by day with the fishermen on the ground, telling them about certification itself. It's also far from this perspective. What they are really need, it's what's have a direct impact from their life and the livelihood. Maybe if we need to understand further about the technology use on their life, because previously 5 years ago, the phone, the smartphone, the YouTube, it's far from the fishermen. But nowadays, it's getting closer to them. Maybe implementing, or what you call it, embedded those kind of technology in their daily lives is maybe also can help us to increasing the transparency or acknowledgement from market sides to the fishermen, so they feel near with the people that basically consuming their fish. That's the thing, because it's also might be lead to the development for the infrastructure here in Indonesia, because all the fish that maybe you are consuming here now in Europe, it's practically harvested in a very remote location in Indonesia with less signal and also less supporting environment that basically need to be produced fish. But from my perspective, as a people that assisted the fishermen and the community day by day, I want to understand further about this kind of discussion that basically maybe representing the market side beside other than the certification side. So we can also strategically develop the approach for the fishermen to produce some responsible yet sustainable also for their livelihood to the market that basically consuming the fish that they are catching.
Mascu, are you selling mostly to northern markets? Are your fishermen selling mostly to northern markets, or is it mostly for the domestic market?
Most of the fishermen that I assisted, it is a community that harvested tuna from hand line and also pollen line.
Yeah.
And the pollen line itself in Indonesia is also now decreasing because competing with the more productive fishing practices like the purseine or the long line, which is sad actually, because in Indonesia, in some certain place in Indonesia itself, there's also a traditional name for the pollen line, which is basically named Hutahate. Maybe Momo also quite familiar with this. It is quite sad because the number is really decreasing, but understanding that they have their own traditional language for those fishing practices, it's known that they are already been incorporated into their way of life, basically. So yeah, understanding, maybe I can try it with my organization. I can try to create some what you call it, acknowledgement or promotion.
And so certification helps your fishermen. So two questions. Certification helps your fishermen to access European or American markets. The other question is, are the purseines certified sustainable as well or not?
Now, talking about the first question, they are helping us to access the wider market, yes, and also helping the government to understanding that they also need to responsible for anything that basically related to the 3 MSC principle, the stock, the impact of the ecosystem, and also the good management that they need to be developed for their own fishermen. And talking about the second question about the purseine market, are they sustainable? That's the thing. The monitoring and surveillance itself in Indonesia is quite challenging. It's a quite monitoring and surveillance nightmare, quote unquote, because we are spreading really in the islands into thousands of islands with a big number and volumes of seas in between. So it's quite challenging to addressing that. But the purseine itself in these last 5 years, they try to be open to the stakeholder discussion. So maybe basically by understanding who's in the zoo, we can ask the government to developing the regulation that basically protecting the small-scale fishermen, because with those kind of regulation, government can decide it the part of the cake that they want to give to the purseine, and protecting the bigger cake for the one that really have a good impact on the community, like the small-scale one.
Okay. That's really interesting. You have a literal voice from small-scale fishing from far away. So thank you very much for that. Lee, do we have some more questions? Because I can't see any more hands up here.
We do. We've got a couple of questions. So Hannah from Sustain has a question. Actually, I've got a couple of questions from Momo, so I'm going to field these both at you. So Hannah is saying that she's very interested in the shift in the payment structure for certification that you mentioned, from fisheries paying directly to different actors within the supply chain paying. Have the actors been supportive of this shift so far? And then we have a second question, which was from Anna Heath, who is saying, what are the next steps for Community Catch and what do you need to get this off the ground?
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, so the shift in the payment structure, are the stakeholders kind of behind it? So we have done outreach and we have kind of asked that question to various nodes of the supply chain. and asked, you know, are you willing to pay? So, I mean, the answer that we will often get is, well, we already pay. And so that is that there are a lot of industry that are supporting improvement projects on the ground. So this would, I guess, be a more structured way, and which would make sure that, you know, it isn't like that the costs don't get landed down at the community level. So we have done quite a deep analysis on certifications in other products. So, for example, cotton, in forestry, and we've looked at the business model kind of across different certification schemes. And this kind of splitting of or getting money from each node in the supply chain, this already exists. It already exists that, you know, the buyers, anybody who gets product that is deemed sustainable or coming from this improving fishery or improving cotton or whatever, that they each pay into it, and that money goes back to the community. So yes, versions of this model already exist. And yes, the feedback so far has been pretty okay. I think it all really depends, right? I mean, we have to, this has to be launched, and we have to see it working in action to see whether the numbers make sense. We as an organization don't want to, you know, make money. We need to pay our staff, and then, you know, what's left over, we need to, you know, keep our standard updated, those kind of things. But after those costs, we kind of want everything else to go back to communities and to keep the system moving. So another piece of that is, we've been talking about how do we do the support for small scale fisheries, right? So it's okay saying let's send the money for the improvements, but how do they have the support to do those improvements? So we're also talking about like creating kind of regional or domestic hubs. So developing kind of an infrastructure in a given country which will support fisheries in that country. And again, can we then, again, from our business model, put money into those hubs that would support technical capacity to support the fisheries on the ground to engage in this, you know, relatively complex certification process. So the business model, it's definitely about being equitable. It's definitely about being transparent. So it's looking good, but again, I think for us to see whether the numbers make sense, we will have to have a few fisheries in the scheme. And then the next question, so what's next for Community Catch? We have a draft standard at the moment, and that draft standard, we're currently looking for 5 international pilots that we want to dig really deep, where we will go through the whole process of, you know, engaging, doing improvements, having the auditing process happening, and having the fisheries engage, talking about the language, the terminologies used, all of that. So with these 5 pilots, we want to like build another version of the standard and kind of start building some of that infrastructure I was talking about. So we're hoping that we would have a public consultation, so put the standard out public, get public feedback on it, and then hopefully have a few fisheries officially in the scheme by next year. So that's the hope. And a lot of that depends on, you know, that we continue to bring in funding to keep this moving. We have a dedicated team of a lot of pro bono people putting work into this. So it obviously all costs money. So if we can keep funding coming in, then we're hoping that this will launch next year. So keep an eye out.
I've got a kind of, there's a question from Dan, which actually, Dan, you could ask yourself, save Lee's vocal cords. But I just want to butt in with one question, and it follows a little bit from the point you said, examples in other certifications. It's always struck me that fishery is the only certification that isn't property demarcated. So if you're running a fair trade project, or if you're running an organic project or a forestry project, you own a piece of land, you certify that piece of land. With fish, you're certifying a straddling stock that swims and that does not belong to you. So my question's kind of, it's different to others and it has its own complication, but is it even the job of anybody to be certifying it? Isn't it the job of government just to manage stocks? And are we kidding ourselves with all these certification efforts or whatever, MSC, community catch, all the others included, to be judging stocks which have got nothing to do with private companies. And that's for Amy as well as Momo. It's a bit of a difficult question. And then Dan, if you could ask your question, that would be great after that. So either of you, if want to volunteer, do you want to have a go, Amy, or have I put you in?
Yes, I mean, I think, Charles, you've just encapsulated the challenge of fisheries management as a whole, which is exactly that. Like, how do you manage something which doesn't belong to anyone and which moves around the sea, and which is probably moving around the sea even quicker and more unpredictably with climate change now? I think, yes, in an ideal world, yes, that's the role of governments, but governments are also not succeeding in doing that. So I understand where MSC and other market schemes came from and the thinking which led that, which is there a complementary way that we can do this? The reality is it takes a bit of everything. A lot of it is kind of bottom-up management as much as we can do at the community level, but there is a need for government and there is a need for the market as well.
Great, thanks. Momo, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I would agree, and I guess the hope of these market schemes is, right, that you know, the consumer is a voter and can ideally push government to move things, right? So ideally, if these market schemes were working appropriately, then yeah, the consumer would also be pushing. The consumer and the whole supply chain would be able then to push governments to move things. So if the certification schemes were working as we would like them to work.
Great, thanks. Dan?
Hi everyone, thank you, fascinating discussion. Just on that last point, if you'll forgive me, a quick tangent, but just to Momo's point about consumers, we talk a lot at the Ethics Council about citizens who consume and vote and do lots of other things to influence, rather than just think of people narrowly as consumers, because it's sort of slightly constrained. So anyway, that was just a quick aside. My question, is around, and Amy obviously touched on this to a degree, but just wondered whether no one can predict the future. I'm not asking you to predict, but just wondered from your personal point of view, both the speakers and Charles potentially, as the people that have been working in this space for a while, do you think the blue tick will still be around in, say out to 2030, will be around in 2030, and if so, what's your kind of one key thing that you would want to ask of MSC, or the biggest thing that you would want to ask of MSC in terms of either improving or transforming, or whatever language you'd want to use? So so do you think the blue tick will still be here in 2030, and what's your kind of biggest ask of MSC?
Shall I jump in on that one first?
Yeah, go for it.
Yes, I think it will definitely be around in 2030. I think it's very entrenched, both in terms of kind of sourcing guidelines for retailers, restaurants, others around the world, but also within government policy. So MSC certification is an official metric within the UN biodiversity framework. So I think it is very entrenched. It's here to stay, and it's in all of our interests that it's working as well as it can be. My biggest ask of MSC would be that it evolves and becomes something that's better suited to a more modern concept of sustainability, which is one where you're looking at people and nature. You're not kind of separating out environmental impacts from human impacts. And as part of that, I would really want it to fix the small scale fisheries issue so that it doesn't continue acting as essentially a market barrier to a lot of really fantastic small scale fisheries.
Yeah, I would agree. I definitely think it'll be around in 2030. There might be criticism at the moment, but yeah, the MSC has gone through various stages of criticism, and I think they'll keep going. And we do have to. I mean, we do have to say that over the 20-25 years of the MSC, I think. The structure that exists now in fisheries and fisheries improvement, it all kind of links to the MSC. Whether that's a good thing or not, there is structure out there. The market is very much more put on, is more aware of what's happening. So I think that, like, what has come out of the whole structure of the MSC, that there is a lot of positive. So I think it will be around in 2030. And what I would ask of them, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure whether, kind of, Amy, you mentioned this earlier, you know, should the MSC reform in order to, you know, to be everything that a certification in fisheries should and could be, or is there space for others? Like, is there space for community catch? And I don't necessarily, right, I don't have the answer to that, but I guess I would ask of the MSC, yeah, to be open that you know, that there are faults in their system, and that we all need to work together to kind of to make sure that we're putting out into the world the systems that can make things change. Because we all say this in fisheries all the time, you know, there are so many small scale fisheries, there are so many fisheries globally, there aren't enough NGOs, there aren't enough certification schemes, there aren't enough people to do the work to get them all to sustainability. So there's plenty of work out there for all of us. So I guess that's what I would ask for.
I think I'll add something to that, Dan. I think it'll be there in 2030. I think I'm thinking of that scene it might fall flat in the Life of Brian, where he's fallen into a ditch saying, "I'm not the Messiah." And I kind of feel that it's almost the MSC ecosystem that's problematic. It's almost the fact that people are saying that it's a very, very high level of sustainability. And the MSC isn't actually saying that. It's saying it's a path towards sustainability in most cases. But sometimes it does say that from a marketing point of view. So I think the marketing people have got beyond themselves. And the MSC recognizes the complexities in fisheries. But the problematic is that it's claiming to be this amazing high standard, and the MSC ecosystem around it, and this is more the companies that say, we will only source 100% MSC, and we will not look at anything else. And we will not talk to anybody else, and we will not recognize anybody else. And we've had, as a company, we've had a massive blockage right across the globe of people who know nothing about fisheries. The first port of call is, well, you're not certified. We've even had it from other certifications. And when you think that if you're sourcing at a higher level, that is very problematic. So I'd like them to say, I'm not the Messiah, to be a lot more honest about what they are. And for me, it's sometimes just a fishery improvement project. It's a journey towards sustainability. These are good things. I could be accused of in the past having misunderstood the improvement aspect that's needed within a sustainability. You know, that you're never perfect, you've always got to improve. And I can understand that improvement journey, but I'd really like to see honesty, both from the MSC and honesty from the people using the MSC, because otherwise they're insulting a lot of the small scale, a lot of the better fisheries, and blocking access to the market. Peter Mims, we've got a question from you.
Can you hear me?
We can, but we can't see you, but that's fine.
No, you don't want to see me. Pretty ugly.
Okay.
So my question is really a thought, actually, and it follows on from what you just said, Charles, and what Amy said. I think the certification is a good way of getting ordinary shoppers to start to even think about what they're eating. Yeah, to start to even think about it. But it really is only a part of going on the way to something which is really about animal welfare, isn't it? And environmental protection. Yeah, that's what it's really about, because the only reason line fishing is better than trawling great big nets around is because trawling great big nets around screws up the whole ocean, yeah, and the whole seabed. So I think this certification thing is a way going towards what in the future there must be some universally accepted animal welfare and environmental protection, which countries will have to follow if they have fishermen. It'd be a bit like whaling. Yeah, everybody used to do it, and now hardly anybody does it. And I think these certification things are a good way of getting people to even start thinking about it. Otherwise, they do not think about what they eat, especially when it's fish and it's fish fingers. They don't care.
So I can answer a little bit of that, because we've been asked animal welfare questions quite a lot. and it is complex. You could say that the most selective methods are better for animal welfare. And you could say the fact that they are wild is better because animal welfare is about, in part, about leaving animals in their natural state. So the natural state of being a fish is often not very pleasant because you're eaten by all sorts of other fish and sharks and whatever else that's there, but that's a natural state. It's very, very hard to do humane killing, especially in the smaller scale fisheries. And so I think there's a danger of confusing. I think animal welfare is an issue that's coming up in sustainability, but there's probably a trade-off, and there's a danger of confusing different ethical kind of preferences or standards or requirements. But Amy, do you want to say something about animal welfare, or Momo? Is there anything that you think, is that something that we should be having more in standards, or is it a separate standard?
I can jump in really quickly. We have a very small section on animal welfare in the community catch standard, and the reason is because it is becoming very topical at the moment. So we really see these waves, right? Initially, it was all about the environment, then the people piece was coming in, and now animal welfare is definitely very topical. And we've decided that we can't humanely killing fish on board a vessel can be quite an expensive process, right? So we're not necessarily going to dock marks of small scale fishers for not having the best of technology on board. But we feel like by bringing it into the standard now that it's at least creating awareness, and we're having, the thought process that we'll have the fisheries document how and what they are doing in their processes, right? So that will create awareness. The documentation will make them aware that this is relevant, that the market cares about this, and that will hopefully in the future bring about change. And I think that speaks to kind of your point, Peter, right? Certification and the pieces that are involved in it are about, creating kind of more awareness and over time creating change, making people more aware of what they're buying, what they're putting in their mouths, that type of thing. So yes, it's being included, but more, obviously there are pieces like shark finning, which is obviously super relevant in fisheries management. So there's definitely some species that have a less humane killing, but I won't go into that, but we're definitely thinking about bringing it in because it is super relevant to people's minds at the moment.
Thanks a lot for that. Is that good, Peter?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was really with animal welfare. I was thinking more of things like what's it called in English? The things you catch alongside. The things
bycatch. The bycatch.
Whatever. Yeah. And in the case of these great big trawlers that go around raking up the seabed, I mean, they're killing all sorts of animals which are never eaten by anybody. But, and I think that would help also the small fishermen who tend to fish selectively.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right there. And it's a point we make in, the most selective you are, the less you have unnecessary kill.
Yeah,
and that's an important point.
Charles, can I just jump in and say?
But better. Sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry, Peter.
Yeah, go for it, Amy.
I was just going to jump in and say, yes, the bycatch is a really key issue that MSC needs to address. There are some MSC certified industrial fisheries with huge amounts of bycatch. And at the end of the day, a consumer in a supermarket buys a tin of tuna. It could come from a pole and line fishery and carry the MSC eco label. It could come from a purse seine fishery that's killing thousands and thousands of sharks every year and also carry the MSC eco label. And that's almost the biggest problem with the definition of sustainability that MSC has set up, is that at the consumer level, those two things look exactly the same, when for all of the reasons that Peter's spoken about, they are very clearly not the same.
Yeah, very good point. We've got 7 minutes left. Lee, is there any questions left on our thread or not?
No, so there's no more questions unless anyone wants to get one in quickly. But Hannah has put an update to the results of the Menti in the chat there.
Can we see them?
What, you can see them? Yeah, well, Hannah, can you share your screen with them, or is it basically?
Yeah, I can just do a quick summary from what I've put in the chat. Just to thank you for everybody who participated. Just to summarise that over 85% of people who completed today are from the fish or fishing or sustainability space. So it's great to have so many experts in the room. Thank you for coming. And then 60% of the people who answered do look for MSC certification when buying fish, where 40% don't. So quite an interesting mix there too. Thank you.
Brilliant. Is there any last questions? Because I think we'll start running it down. And I mean, unfortunately, both fortunately and unfortunately, fisheries is something that fish people can talk about until everyone else is long dead. And so I'm sure Amy and Momo and I and maybe some others could carry on forever, but it's also dinner time. So is there any last minute questions? Thanks for the lol there, Jenny. And any last minute questions? So I think we'll wrap up. You can see the On the Hook website. It's www.onthehook.org, is it not?
.org.uk, yeah.
.org.uk, community catch. I just typed it in and it goes straight to the community catch. So you can find things there. You can ask if you want some questions, I think through our own Food Talks website.
Perfect.
We're going to have so the idea with Food Talks is we cover a general topic, food ethics issue topic. I think we've got an idea for next September. Can I bring you in on that, Dan, if we do have a topic come in?
I believe we're going to be exploring some of the bridging the gap work that maybe Hannah wants to just say a very brief
Hannah,
word.
it's your talk, isn't it, Hannah? So do you want to just give us a little preview and kind of come into the website and these talks are always free, really. The whole idea is to be open and let everyone participate and have a bit of a conversation. And thank you so much to Momo and Amy for committing your time to us and for joining this conversation. Thank you very, very much to everybody for joining us. But let's just have a little bit of a plug for the next talk, please, Hannah.
Absolutely. So I'm from Food and Farming Alliance Sustain, and we're hoping to do our next talk on one of our key programs, which is called Bridging the Gap, which is all about how you bridge that gap between people on low incomes and the cost of agroecological produce, and what kind of solutions and innovative things there are out there to try and bring those two things closer together. So there'll be more information coming really soon, and we'll let you know dates and our speakers as soon as they're ready.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Hannah. Thanks, everybody that helped make this work, and see you again soon, I hope. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye now.